Hi, and welcome to Make It Fun Tips and Tricks, where I'm going to give you a little bit more insight into some of the things that I did while I was creating the Mary and Joseph cutout. This video is going to be a little bit more laid back, and like I said, it's just going to be a few extra details that I didn't have time to put into the main video, the how-to video. The first thing I want to go over is selecting the characters that you're going to display in your yard. When I am coming up with a new scene, a new display to put in the front yard, I try to have a purpose for the characters being together. If you'll notice, Mickey and Minnie, Donald and Daisy, they're singing songs around the lamppost. Belle is reading stories to the Beast at the fireplace. The characters from Frozen are gathered around the tree with the presents underneath it. There's a story going on in the scene that I try to create. Now, it's okay if you just make a bunch of different characters and throw them out in the yard. It's going to look fun and people will enjoy it, but I think it's more enchanting if you select your characters and have them tell a story. One of the things you might be asking is, how do you find Coroplast? The way I went about it was, I called a local sign company and I told them what I was going to do, that I was going to be making decorations for my front yard, because I didn't want them to think that I was going to be in competition with them. And they told me where they got it from, so I called their supplier and was able to purchase it from them. So you might try that to see if you can find Coroplast fairly close to where you are. Secondly, if you're using a wood-based product instead of Coroplast, make sure that you seal the product against the weather. I used to use a product called Masonite as a wood-based product. And I used it for a really long time. The issue I had with using Masonite was that if I didn't get it sealed really well, like I would coat the front and the back edges with a primer and paint it, and you had to get all the edges sealed after you cut out the figure. And it would always, there'd be some little place that I would miss when I would be sealing it, and water was able to permeate, and it would cause the Masonite to swell up a little bit in that area. So if you do use a wood-based product, make sure you seal it really, really well. You can also purchase marine grade or exterior grade plywood. It's a lot heavier and a lot more expensive, but it is available. Oh, there's another reason that you might want to paint your Coroplast white. In the how-to video, I told you to give it a coat of white exterior latex primer before you started doing your drawing and painting on there, and I gave you two reasons for that. There is a third reason, and there's a story behind that. One of my first characters that I was making was Santa Claus. And of course, Santa has the white beard and the white trim around the hat and the white trim around the bottom of the coat and different areas. So there's a lot of white on there. And so I decided that I would just leave the white as the white of the Coroplast. And I painted Santa's face, flesh color, and I was painting red on the hat and the coat and things like that, and I spilled a little drop of red paint on Santa's white beard, and I thought, well, that's no problem, I'll just take a wet rag and I'll wipe it off. It came off for the most part, but it left a pink spot right in the middle of Santa's beard, and I thought, well, that's really not that big of a deal either. I'll just paint over it with some white. So I got some white paint and painted over the pink, and then I had a big blob of white paint in the middle of the white Coroplast because the white paint did not match the white Coroplast. So I ended up having to paint all the beard, all the trim of the hat and the coat and everything else white with a white paint just because I spilled a little bit of red paint. So since that time, I have painted the whole thing with white primer before I even start. That way, if I do mess up and make a mistake, I can just go over the mistake with the white primer and cover it up. Another thing I wanted to talk about was finding how I go about finding the images that I use on the internet. When I do a search for characters, like let's say I'm looking for Santa, I will type in Santa coloring page. And the reason that I add coloring page is because when you're coloring out, printing out a page to color, the lines are very definite on a coloring page. Like if you open up a coloring book, you look at it, you know exactly where the lines are, and it's real easy to be able to follow those lines when you project your image onto the Coroplast. So I always try to find images that are coloring pages. You might be wondering where to find an overhead projector. If you don't have a digital projector, an overhead projector is a fairly inexpensive way to go. You could look on Craigslist to see if there are any overhead projectors for sale. You also might check with your local Board of Education, because overhead projectors used to be used quite a bit in the classroom. Those have now been replaced with digital projectors. So you might get in contact with the school system and see if they have any overhead projectors, and if they do, if they would be willing to sell you one. You can probably find one pretty cheap. Another thing that I mentioned in the how-to video was trying to keep your characters in scale when you are projecting the image onto the Coroplast. And what I do is I'll project a lot of the images I use are like Superman here. I projected the image up there, and I made him, he's probably about 6'2", 6'3", something like that. So he's a little bit taller than I am. So when I projected the image up there, I would actually walk up to the Coroplast and measure the top of my head compared to the top of Superman's head, and I made sure that he was the right height that I wanted to be. Then when I did the other superhero characters, I did Superman, Batman, Captain America, and Wonder Woman. I made sure that they were all in scale with Superman because he was the first one I did. So I made Batman about the same height. Captain America might have been an inch shorter. Wonder Woman was just barely shorter. So I kept them all in the same scale because I wanted, since I was putting them together in a scene, I wanted to make sure that they were all the appropriate height compared to one another. I use, you can see that I've used, the black that's simply a magic marker. It's a permanent magic marker, and I've used those for years and years and years and never had any trouble. I keep lots of them around because you can dull the tips of them pretty quickly. Once I dull the tip of a magic marker, I usually only use that afterwards on doing the edge because it's kind of frayed and kind of tough plastic, and it chews up the tips. So once I mush a tip down and don't want to use it for detail work, I use it for outlining the exterior line around the character. Oh, one other thing about magic markers: don't use red permanent magic markers. They're not permanent. They run. I did a character and used a red magic marker. I can't remember why. And the first time it rained, the red ink just ran all the way down the front surface of the project. In trying to save a little bit of money, I explained that I take 2x4s, pressure-treated 2x4s, and I cut them down to 1.5 by 1.5. What I didn't have time to explain was I actually cut the 2x4s down to a little bit less than 1.5 by 1.5. Just maybe 1/8 of an inch less, something like that. And in doing so, I cut out my 1 3/8 and 1 3/8, and that leaves me probably around 3/4 of an inch left over, and I take that leftover cutoff and I make stakes out of it. So you can make pretty good use out of the entire 2x4 by getting 2 1.5 by 1.5 and another 3/4 by 1.5. Use the leftover, make some stakes, and that you've got a couple of stakes to put up one of your characters. Something you can do when you're attaching the Coroplast to the frame is set a light behind the Coroplast and frame. The light will shine onto the Coroplast, shine through the Coroplast, and leave a shadow, an outline of where the frame is. That way you can take your screws with your washers and screw straight through the Coroplast into your frame, and there's really no guesswork about it. You can see exactly where the frame is. One other thing, I wanted to show you the screws with the washers that I use. Are 1 1/4 inch. These are the ones that I use to attach the Coroplast figure to the frame. They are 1 1/4 inch, and I use a regular 1/4 inch flat washer. It's not one of the I forget what they called the other ones, but I use a 1 1/4 inch decking screw with a 1/4 inch flat washer, and I'll try to take a close-up picture of that for you so you can see exactly what it is that I use. The ratio of paint to water that I use when I'm creating the paint that I'm going to use for doing shading is probably about 4 to 1, 4 parts water to 1 part paint. It's really watered down, but it still gives you, it's opaque enough that you can see it when you put it on the Coroplast. Another thing about when you're staking up your characters, you want to drive the stake. I probably drive mine about 1 foot down into the ground, something like that. It really depends on what the weather's been like before I go out to set up my display. If it's been dry for several weeks, I can't get the stakes pounded down into the ground as far as I can if it had been raining, let's say the week before or a few days before, and the ground is a little bit softer. So I try to get it pounded down into the ground about 1 foot. That seems to give me a good solid base for having the stake in the ground. But like I said, sometimes I can only drive the stake maybe 8 inches into the ground. You just want to make sure that it doesn't wobble, it's not too flimsy, and that it feels good and solid after you pound it into the ground. Like I said, about 1 foot should work. I also wanted to share with you an alternative to using wooden stakes. I started using Metal Conduit that is pretty inexpensive. I get it at the big box stores. It comes in, I think, 10-foot lengths. I put a metal cutting blade on my miter saw, and I'll cut it to whatever length I need. At one end, I will cut about a 45-degree angle, and that makes it easier for me to drive it into the ground. I don't think that step's necessary, but I do that anyway. Then in order to attach the frame to the conduit, I take some pipe strapping. This is for hanging pipes, and I will wrap it around and then take a screw and go through the holes that are in the strapping and screw directly into the frame. Metal Conduit has worked really well, and the reason I started using it was because by the time I take my Christmas display down, the ground is usually frozen, and I was having difficulty getting the wooden stakes out of the ground, and I was breaking a lot of them when I was trying to urge them to come out of the ground. So that's why I started using the metal. I also talked about creating a base for each of my characters in my how-to video, and Superman is a great example of why I did that. If you'll notice, I've made the base in a semicircle, and it goes out to just a little bit wider than his feet. If I had cut out Superman all the way around the outline of his body, I would not have had much surface to be able to make a frame to put him, stand him up in the yard. I would have had to take my frame and run it right behind this leg and the other piece and run it behind this leg and then meet up right here behind his cape. In painting this surface a dark gray and making a base that is dark green, both of those colors fade out at nighttime when you've got the spotlight shining on it, but it gives me a whole lot more surface area to be able to screw the Coroplast to the frame, and it makes the whole thing a lot more solid. Thanks for joining me for the tips and tricks on how to make the Mary and Joseph Coroplast cutout figure. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them down in the comment section, and I'll try to answer them for you. If you would, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.